Right, guys, again, I know I've got a couple videos out on this, but I feel like I don't ever have enough. And how to check if your engine is running hot. I'm going to go over some of the signs of things that will tell you that your engine is running hot. And then we'll go over later in the video how to correct some of those things and things that are normal, some things that aren't. Seems like every time I start recording, the dogs start barking next door. Isn't that great? Sorry about that, guys. Can't do anything about that. So number one thing, the problems that signs that you will see that tells you your engine running hot. Number one thing, if you're driving it on the highway and you're somewhere you can hear it and you floor the engine and it's pinging and then you let off and it stops, that's telling you it's on the edge, it's running hot. Other things are, you can get out and try and grab your dipstick. Be careful, touch it a couple times. You don't need a temperature gauge. I mean, guys go, oh yeah, I need a temperature gauge to tell me the heat. If you can't put your hand on your dipstick and keep it there for any period of time, your engine's running hot. That's your oil temperature. I like to have a head temperature gauge on my car on an engine that I'm very concerned with. Like this big truck right here carries basically 2 buses, the weight of 2 buses. So I have an oil temperature or a head temperature gauge. Oil temperature is a secondary thing. Oil temperature rises a lot of times because head temperature is very high. If your head temperature is very high, it'll transfer into the oil. So just monitoring oil temp is never going to give you where the problem lies. You need to know if those heads are getting hot. If the heads are getting hot, the oil is going to get hot after that. And if you just fix the oil problem and you don't fix the head problem, why the heads are getting hot, then you're not really figuring out what's going on. And yeah, you can have your oil temperature come down, maybe you're not getting vapor lock anymore, but the real problem isn't fixed. I don't know if I've went through this already, but vapor lock. A lot of guys think vapor lock is an individual thing. A lot of times vapor lock happens right here in the fuel pump. So a lot of times if your fuel pump is getting too hot, the fuel inside the fuel pump boils and then it won't go up to the carburetor. And what vapor lock does is basically you'll be driving on the road and your engine will just shut off or start sputtering, and you'll pull over and you'll turn it off, and then sometimes after a few minutes you can start it back up. If you want a little quicker way to do that, carry a bottle of water with you, pour it on your fuel pump slowly. Don't just douse it, okay? You could crack the thing by doing that, by shocking it. So I pour some on there slowly and cool it down, and then I can get off the road or whatever to let the engine cool. And at the same time, check your dipstick heat. If you can't touch it, it's telling you oil temp's very high. If the oil temp is high, it will transfer into the case and it will transfer into the fuel pump. So people try and put, like I've heard a lot of guys go, yeah, protect this line. Sometimes that's an issue with vapor lock. Like right now mine's touching, well, it's not touching. If it's touching this exhaust right here, it can get too hot. Some guys used to put wooden clothespins on here and that would, cool off that line. I didn't find that to really change anything much, because usually the issue is inside the fuel pump where it's getting too hot. So you got to monitor the dipstick temperature. So what I do is I will touch that thing, see if it's too hot to touch. If I can touch it and hold it for any amount of time, it's usually fine. Okay, that usually tells me it's around 200-ish. Okay, they say too hot's like 230 or something like that, somewhere in there. 220 is runnable, but to me, at 220, you're probably even going to have some issues with vapor lock occasionally. I try to keep my oil temps under 200. Now to do that, to get it under 200 or around 200 or less, you're going to need 2 coolers. There's no way around it. So I'll run a doghouse cooler. A doghouse cooler is, I'm going to show you, it's behind here. So I don't know if you can see that. See if we can get you guys back here. The doghouse cooler is this cooler that sticks out the back of the doghouse. It's not the shape of this cooler. A lot of guys will think, oh, it's a doghouse cooler because it's round. No, it's a cooler that is on the back side of the fan shroud, and it has a bigger fan. In fact, you can start up an engine a lot of times and you can listen to it. If it has a little bit of a fan whistle, that'll tell you that it's more than likely a doghouse. I mean, I can get in there and fire it up and I can hear it right away myself, and I can tell that it's got that fan whistle, so it's got that doghouse cooler behind there. So I will put a doghouse cooler on, and I'll have a full flow system from the oil pump. I'll have these lines going all the way up to the front of the vehicle in this thing. And I will have a second oil cooler. This is another oil cooler with a thermostatic fan. So if you see there, those wires, there's also a relay. I put a second fan on these things. When you do that, this is over and above the factory engineering. Some guys say, well, the 1600 had the best cooling system on it. You know, you don't need all that extra stuff. Look, things are different now than they used to be back when these cars were built. They had leaded fuel. Okay, you had things that were way different. Leaded fuel, the fuel did not have alcohol in it like it does today. Some guys say run alcohol-free oil fuel. That might be helpful, but if the octane is not a premium fuel, then that's not going to help you. You need to run premium fuel in your Volkswagen. Well, back in the day, it was 90 RON. I've heard all these stories. It was 90 RON, and 90 RON translates to 88 or 86, I don't know, American, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's not leaded anymore. There's no lead in the fuel. The lead is what was a cooling agent for the cylinders. And in an air-cooled engine, the combustion temperatures are much higher than in a water-cooled engine. Let's go over that. So if you know, your water-cooled engine, the old days in the 60s, the temperature of the thermostat was 160 degrees. In the 80s, because of emissions, they moved it to 180 degrees. In the 90s and up, they've gone to 190 to 192 degrees. In some places, I think it's 195. Well, if it ain't the dogs blowing, it's the leaf blower. How about that? Either the dogs are barking or the leaf blower's going on. I just love this. So air-cooled engines run at 106 or 260 degrees to 300 and some odd degrees, around maybe up to like 320. That is very hot. It's on the hot side, okay? But some engines end up running that hot. They say climbing a hill, these engines can go up to 425 degrees climbing a hill. The racing guys are saying that for off-road racing. So, okay, 160 degree engine temperature versus 420. You need premium fuel, guys. You need that extra because you've got higher temperatures on your cylinder heads. That's causing higher temperatures causing higher pressures. It equals higher pressures. Okay, so you need to have that premium fuel. It's very important. So real quick, let's bust the thermostat issue. As I said just a minute ago, 160 degrees is an adequate temperature for every other engine on the planet. So tell me, if you take one of these, after running your engine for 10 minutes in normal temperatures, I'm not saying that you don't need them if you're in a super cold climate, Most of us are not running our engines in the snow anymore, I hope. But after running it for 10 minutes, take this guy right here, shoot it on your cylinder head, and tell me, is it above 160 degrees? If it is, it's an adequate running temperature for every other engine on the planet. Why wouldn't it be for air-cooled? All that stuff people say doesn't make sense to me. Bet you it's 180, might even be 200 degrees after 10 minutes running on a 40-degree day probably. So another problem people have a lot of times is they'll have their engine run too lean. And the way that the old school backyard method of doing it is checking that is to put larger main jets in until the point where it runs like crap, and then start leaning them out little by little. Yeah, it takes a lot of jets to do. Lean it out little by little until it doesn't run like crap anymore, and usually that's going to be maybe a little bit rich, but better than if it's too lean. There's always the basic things to make sure that your engine seal's good, that you don't have, like if you're not running heat risers and all that or whatever, make sure those holes are filled up, or have a blank tin back here to make sure that you don't have any air leaks. A little bit like here, that's okay. That doesn't usually cause an issue. It's when you have those big holes, that's a problem. Or if you're missing the rubber here and you've got a big gap, sometimes even if you have the rubber missing and it's really tight, that's not too much of an issue, but it should be fixed. Because if you remember, all your air goes in through the fan and comes out through the backside of the engine, and when you're going down the road, it'll start to push its way back up in here. And if you don't have that fixed, little by little, the heat just keeps recycling through the engine over and over until she gets really super hot. So though having the ones on the back side of the engine are the most important ones to have the holes filled on. Another thing that you could have an issue with is maybe you've got too much advance in your timing, especially if you're not running premium fuel. You need to have your timing pretty retarded. Some guys are only running 28 degrees of total advance on their car, and that's total advance. So I'm not talking about what it is at idle. I'm talking about what it is total advance when you have it revved up to about 3,000 RPMs. That's what your total advance is. So I checked that, and 28 degrees of total advance might be the number you need to be at. Depends on the engine. Every engine's different. Somewhere between 28 and 32 is the average. I've had engines that needed more advance than that. It just depends on the cam you have, all that other stuff. So the backyard method is a good way to do your jetting, but if you don't want to do that, if you want to do something more than that, you can add an exhaust bung like this after your collector, and basically it's a little piece for an oxygen sensor. You take this plug out, put an oxygen sensor in there. This is my wideband setup. There's a gauge here that I'll put inside the cab. I'll put this oxygen sensor in. I have a wiring harness that I run all the way up inside the cab, all the way so I can look at it while I'm driving it. With that, I'll drive it on flat ground, I'll drive it on hills, I'll drive it all the different areas and make sure that my mixture is within the parameters that it should be. I don't know exactly what that is. I can't remember. I have to look that up every time I do it, but there is that. So if you want to make it right, that's another way to do it. So if your engine's running lean, it's going to run hot, and you need to check for vacuum leaks, check your intake manifolds, make sure, be very careful, because you can have a random spark on these things and it could get in your face, all kinds of stuff, maybe have a face shield on, whatever. Be very careful doing that, but I will go and check by putting, I usually will use propane on with a little hose, and I'll go around all the openings and I'll make sure that the idle doesn't change while the engine's running. Some guys will do that with carburetor spray, but again, remember, it's flammable. That can catch fire and can be very hazardous when you're trying to do that. So be very mindful of that when if you're going to do that, and do that at your own risk, of course. Check your carburetor gasket, make sure it's not leaking. Check your other intake manifold. The single ports are pretty good at not leaking. The dual ports will have those little bellows in the middle, and a lot of times those leak. And if you've got a intake manifold leak on that, that's going to cause usually a lean situation and make your engine run hot. It'll do all the stuff. You'll get vapor lock. You'll get, you know, all those signs. Another thing that it will give me an indicator for me, because I'm running chromoly push rods, okay? Because I'm running chromoly push rods and I'm running my lash at 0, when I'm climbing a hill and my engine starts to get hot, what it'll do is it'll start missing really quick. It'll get just a little bit hot and it'll start missing a little bit. And if it's missing a little bit, it's telling me the engine's getting hot. So I just slow down, drop a gear, get the RPMs up, get the load way down on the engine. So if you're climbing a hill, get into a gear that's effortless for the engine and have the RPMs up nice and high so that more air goes through the engine, helps cool it down. I do that, and usually then all of a sudden my cylinder picks back up again. So when I was having an issue, I actually figured out that it was a jetting issue on my other engine. I knew I was running too lean. I added a larger main jet. Now it doesn't do that. So those are the types of things that I do to kind of look those things over. So the arguments, let's go over a couple of them. Well, you shouldn't need to do any of these modifications to your engine because these cars, when they were made from the factory, they had the oil cooler that came in them, and you shouldn't need to add 2 oil coolers and all that other stuff. Well, let's talk about some of that stuff. What was the Volkswagen made for? It was made basically for in-town driving. It was the people's car. It was for going from a little town to another little town. It wasn't meant for freeway, highway driving. And most of us that were going on a road today, we're taking them on freeways. And if you're not, then maybe you don't need to do these things, okay? But if you are, this thing running at a higher RPM for long periods of time, it gets pretty hot. You start watching things, if you have an oil temp gauge, you'll see that it'll climb up to a pretty hot temperature and stay there. They were not really designed for that type of driving. So in order for them to work for that kind of driving, like this truck right here, was never meant to leave Mayence, Germany. It was never meant to drive on a highway. It was never meant to drive on a Autobahn. Okay, I'm driving it on the highway, 60 miles to a show. So I need to do things to modify it. If you're not doing what the car was designed for originally, which is just driving it in town and never leaving your city, that's really what the car was made for, then you need to kind of look at some of the engineering things and upgrade them a bit. People will say if you run a 1600 single port, it's, with the stock stand-up cooler on it, it runs the coolest of all the engines. Back in the early days when we used to work on these, I used to have them come in the shop overheated. And, we changed them to doghouse, and it worked. Even just going to a doghouse cooler for the average guy running at 100-degree temperatures, which, again, that's another thing that these things were not designed for. They were not designed to drive in 100-degree temperatures like they were in Germany. In Germany, what's the high temperature out there? 85, something like that, 90, maybe on a hot day. In the U.S., it's 110, 115. Maybe some other places in the world, it's even hotter than that. These engines will run in those kind of temperatures. They don't mind it, but you got to do some modifications to them to make them happy. And doing those modifications, again, the fuels have changed, the climate has changed for these cars because, again, they were made for Germany climate. They're being driven in other things now, or we're driving them on different types of driving. We're driving on the freeways. We're going faster on the freeways than we used to, and all that stuff. And so when you do that, you need to modify a few things to make it run cooler. Personally, since I have done the modifications that I've done to my engines, when everything's right. Like I said, I was having an issue and it would start missing. And of course, when I fixed the issue and I put the richer main jet in, because the original main jets were designed for leaded, non-alcohol fuels, and the new stuff, sorry, it's got alcohol in it. So you have to put a bigger main jet in from what the factory put in here. I mean, this thing, I'm running a 130 main jet. What came into these originally was like a 122.5. So 130 is about the average, depending on what size exhaust you have. This is an 1800. You know, somewhere in there. It could be 135. Could be as little as a 125.5 or 120, 122. I mean, I had that when I had the stock exhaust on here, because the stock exhaust needed a smaller main jet. There was enough flow going through it to have the bigger main jet in it. So it just depends. You got to have the right one. But if you start with, say, a 130-ish, something like that for your 1600, you're going to be pretty close. And at least it may not run too hot. And on the dual carbs, I've heard of guys running about 130 mains on those. Typically somewhere in there. I'm not a dual carb guy, so I can't answer those questions, guys. I never ran them for years. I always ran 2 barrels because I was daily driving the car. I did not want to have to get out and pull a jet out and clean it. I just didn't want to go through that. So I always ran a 2 barrel, and I never had any issues. I never had to touch my carburetor. Car always started up and ran and just did its thing, even though I treated it like hell. So anyway, those are just a few things for you guys. I hope it helps. I really don't know what else to say. I forget things when I was making the first couple videos, and then I remember them, and then I forget them sometimes while I'm trying to make the video. So hopefully I covered everything. And there's always the comment section if you're having an issue, or if you know another idea that works, you can put those down there for helping the other people that are trying to get their car running and keep it running on the road. So anyway, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.